To be here with all of you today. So there are some phrases in the life of the church that become so familiar that we stop hearing them. They roll off our tongue with ease, they sit comfortably in our liturgies, and yet their disruptive power gets dulled over time. Go and make disciples is one of them. It has shaped movements and missions, denominations, and entire expressions of Christianity. It has been used to inspire, to mobilize, to organize, and if we're honest, at sometimes to control. Some have heard in it a promise: follow Jesus and your life will be blessed with visible success. Others have heard a mandate: build something large, something measurable, something that proves the kingdom is advancing. And still others have heard it as a kind of spiritual insurance policy. Make sure as many people as possible are heaven-bound, marked safe by the name Christian. But somewhere along the way, we have often reduced discipleship to a transaction or a destination. We have treated it as a one-time offer, something we extend to others rather than a way of living that moves through us. A way of being that flows from person to person, encounter to encounter, generation to generation. In the Wesleyan tradition, rooted in the theology of John Wesley, discipleship has never been merely about belief or affiliation. It has always been about transformation. Wesley spoke of holiness of heart and life, not as moral perfectionism, but as a dynamic participation in the love of God that reshapes us and through us reshapes the world. So what if go and make disciples is not primarily about producing Christians, but about cultivating a way of life where people become more fully who they were created to be in God? A people who have a growing proximity to the Christ. What if discipleship is less about conformity and more about transformation? What if our encounter with Christ is not meant to make us simply replicas, but to make us real, who we were always created to be and to become, and not just for the sake of our own humanity, but also for the sake of those beside us, among us, around us, and even those we have yet not known. Imagine if we thought about making disciples as not simply what we receive, but also about the world we long to see brought to life. Because the truth is, we are already making disciples. For some of us, we've been discipled to understand the place of women as under men, and that shapes our worldview. For some of us have been discipled to see Western values as equivalent to Christian values, which shapes our worldview. For some, we've been discipled to see wealth as the standard of God's faithfulness, and this too shapes our worldview. And each of us in this room were discipled intentionally and unintentionally, formed to operate in the world through a specific lens and way of being and seeing. Some of it holds harm, some of it holds opportunity, some of it ought to be held onto tightly, and others we need to let go of. Which means the question is not whether we are making disciples, the question is what kind of disciples are we forming? And what kind of world are these disciples trying to create? Because discipleship is never neutral. It always produces something. It always shapes someone. It always points toward a particular vision of life together. And if we are a people who claim to be Jesus-centered, then our discipleship must reflect the life and way of Jesus. It must take on the texture of his ministry, the rhythm of his relationships, and the posture of his heart. And when we look closely at Jesus, what becomes clear over and over again is that discipleship in his hands consistently moves towards belonging. At West Springs Church, when we think about Jesus' invitation to make disciples, there are 4 values that shape how we preach, that shape our ministry, that shape our board conversations, and our pursuit of spiritual formation. And the first is Jesus-centered, which we talked about a few weeks ago as we considered what it means to be in proximity to Christ rather than to simply say we are in proximity to the title Christianity. And then we come to radical belonging, wisdom-seeking, and impactful action. And today we sit with that second value. And what I argue is that this is the most challenging of all of the values that we hold as a congregation. It goes like this: following Jesus' example of surprising grace and inclusion, we aspire for our building, our hearts, and our lives to be spaces where everyone can feel loved and find belonging. We believe this will lead to profound connections that enrich our lives, our faith, and our community. And at first glance, it sounds simple. Of course, we want to be a place of welcome. Of course, we want to extend grace. Of course, we want people to feel as though they belong. But in practice, history tells us a very different story. Because both our religiosity and our humanity, our proximity to power, often give us more reasons to exclude than to include. More reasons to be protectionist than to be liberated in how we hold or close the doors. More reasons to draw lines than to erase them. We live in a world that is marked by everything that makes us different languages, different ideologies, different lived experiences, different understandings of identity, culture, race, and belonging itself. And so the invitation to form disciples who embody radical belonging is not just inspiring, it's deeply challenging. It presses against our instincts, it exposes our fears, and it calls us into a way of life that is costly and beautiful. Because belonging is something that we crave and something we struggle to extend. And so if we are to take seriously the call to go and make disciples, then we must ask, what does it look like for us to form disciples who embody radical belonging? Oh, thank you. And to answer that, we turn to Jesus. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, belonging is not this abstract idea. It's something that Jesus enacts in real time, in real relationships, in real moments of tension and need. From the stories of healing, the way outcasts are given second chances, and even in the names and resumes of those whom Jesus calls his disciples. The theme of belonging is everywhere, even in today's passage in Mark chapter 6, the well-known story of the feeding of the 5,000. When we encounter the story of the feeding of the crowd, it's so easy to focus on the miracle of provision, but there is something else happening under the surface. Because the hunger in that crowd is not just physical, it is also relational and communal. It's a hunger to be seen, it's a hunger to be welcomed, it's a hunger that begs that we will not be sent away. And the disciples, overwhelmed and exhausted, respond in a way that feels familiar. Send them to someone else to solve their problems. Send them to someone else to meet their needs. Send them to someone else to ensure they know that they are valued and loved and belong. It is the response of scarcity. It is the response of limitation. The response of people who feel they do not have enough to meet the need that is right in front of them. And if we're honest, that's often how radical belonging feels to us. It feels like there isn't enough time to welcome. There isn't enough energy to bring others in. There isn't enough resources to actually find ways to lean into what it looks like to belong. There just aren't enough people to make it happen. There are too many differences, too many complexities, too many unknowns. And so we, like the disciples, are tempted to create distance. But Jesus interrupts this instinct with these words. He says, no, you give them something to eat. In other words, no, you make space, You take responsibility, you participate in their belonging. And when the disciples protest, when they name the impossibility of the situation, Jesus does not dismiss their concern. Instead, he reframes it and he says, well, what do you have? And when what they have is placed in Jesus' hands, it becomes enough. Not just barely enough, not just enough for a few, but enough for everyone with so much left over. For those present, their minds would hearken back to an Old Testament story of Elisha during the famine, discovering that a little bit of bread could be multiplied into enough for all of those who were with him. Or the tale of Elijah and the oil, where a small amount is multiplied into more than enough. Or the story of manna in the wilderness, where everyone had everything that they needed. And for these brief moments in histories, it becomes clear that we are designed to be a people who operate with an enough mindset, whether it comes to sharing what we hold in our hands or making space at our tables. And it's all well and good for me to preach on this. It's great for me to speak with passion about it, to courageously instruct you on it, but to live this out requires something of us. Diane Butler Bass, in her book, Christianity for the Rest of Us, notes, although hospitality is free, it is not without cost. Indeed, the practice of welcoming the stranger is risky and sometimes dangerous. Hospitality can be frightening at times. The work of radical belonging, when it asks us to confront nothing, to engage with the same people we always do, to make space for people we easily get along with, we consider it joy. But sometimes the work of belonging is difficult. For it asks us to face our ideas of the other, to challenge our ideologies, to let go of our fears that have sheltered us, our preconceptions that have shaped us, and our biases that have been formed right inside of us. And nowhere is this better outlined in the Gospels than Jesus face to face with a woman titled the Syrophoenician. Hopefully I'm saying it right. Dr. Will Gaffney writes about her as a woman who changed Jesus. N.T. Wright notes that her presence in the text is dangerous. And both authors, although they tackle the text quite differently, see Jesus in a position we don't often imagine, having to intentionally consider the inclusion of someone unexpected. A woman who Dr. Gaffney notes is a Canaanite to whom the Israelite notions towards them were no more generous than how the Romans viewed the Jews. In other words, she was considered unwanted, she was unwelcome, she was unclean, and part of the very people that those in Jesus' circles would have crossed the street to avoid. And we are reminded that the primary challenge of belonging is not what we lack, it's who we have decided not to love. And this woman unequivocally does not belong. She is not one that those in Jesus' circle had decided was their responsibility to extend love to extend belonging to. And yet here she comes and she kneels in front of Jesus and she asks. She says, Jesus, will you heal my daughter? And Jesus says, no. He says, why should I take care of you when I first need to feed the children of my own family, the Jews? It isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs. And there are so many of us who wish that's where the story ended, because it would affirm so much of what we like to believe and what we wish we could preach, that no, let me take care of me and mine and only those who look and sound and belong to me. Gaffney notes that Jews in the first century and the rabbinic period despised dogs. They were unclean scavengers that ate dead flesh. And so we do not see this as complimentary. Instead, we see Jesus is drawing a line in the sand. He draws a kind of boundary. He names a distinction. He articulates a line between those who belong and those who do not. And it is uncomfortable for us, the reader. It disrupts our assumptions, and it forces us to sit in the tension of a moment where belonging is not easily or immediately extended. But there is something about Jesus, or something about her desperation, that calls her to respond to his dismissal with this rebuttal. She says, "My Lord, even dogs eat the crumbs from beneath the master's table." Gaffney notes that the term Lord is often used with religious emphasis, but it is also understood to be a term for a slave master. And that her insistence and persistence in addressing the one she calls Lord is as though she is challenging Jesus to show her what kind of Lord he will be, loving God or slave master. She refuses to accept a world where she and her daughter are outside the reach of mercy, where they are incapable of finding belonging. And in that moment, something shifts because belonging is not always extended easily. Sometimes it's demanded, sometimes it's wrestled into existence, sometimes it comes through voices that challenge us, disrupt us, and call us to expand beyond what we thought was possible. And Jesus considers the table that is too full, that has too much work, that has so much left to be done. And he does something remarkable. He asks everyone who is sitting at the proverbial table to move over a little and to make room for her. He says, "I want you two to grab a plate. I want you two to come and sit at this table. I want you two to know that there is space for her," as he decides that he must not follow his own commands, that he must now follow his own command and give her something to eat. He praises her faith and announces her daughter is made well. Radical belonging is not always about our capacity. Sometimes it is all about who we decide is or is not worthy of receiving our extension of love, our offer of belonging, our welcome to the table. And if we are honest, those are often the moments that reveal the limits of our ability to be known and identified as ones who go and make disciples. Because discipleship that does not expand beyond belonging is not yet fully formed in the way of Jesus. Which brings me back to Luke 14. That's where we ended a few weeks ago as we considered the value Jesus-centered. You might recall it, the story about a banquet, a story about invitation, a story about who shows up and who does not. And when the expected guests decline their invitation, reject the offer to join at the table, the host does not cancel the feast. He doesn't close down the event. He doesn't reduce the scale of the celebration. He does not withdraw the invitations. Instead, he expands it. He expands the invitation into the streets and into the alleys and into the margins, with the expected and the unexpected finding space at these grand tables where all kinds are told that they belong. And when it seems that everyone who ought to be there is present, the host stands up and announces with a grand invitation, there is still room for more. Radical belonging. So much more than our capacity. Sometimes the unexpected places create unexpected bounty, with room enough for everyone. Radical belonging, as much about who we choose to love as it is about who we decide is unworthy of love, unworthy of tables extended and space expanded. But something remarkable shifts when we begin to make space, when making room becomes more and more of who we are. Right there with the unexpected. Right there with when we know we do not have enough. Radical belonging announces with grand surprise and invitation, there is still room for more. And when we hold all of these stories together, this pattern emerges. In every instance, the movement is outward, the circle is widening, the table is expanded, the invitation is extended, which brings us back to the words we thought we already understood: go and make disciples. What if this is not a call to create uniformity, but a call to cultivate community? A call to cultivate communities of belonging that are centered on Jesus. What if making disciples is not about gathering people into sameness, but about forming people who know how to make space for our differences? What if discipleship is not measured by how many people we bring in, but by how deeply we embody the kind of belonging that Jesus lived? Because to make disciples in the way of Jesus is to become a people who refuse to send others away. It's to become a people who trust that what we have is enough. It's to become a people who are willing to be changed by those whom we once kept at a distance. It is to become a people who keep making room. People who, when faced with scarcity, choose generosity. People who, when faced with difference, choose curiosity that leads to welcome. People who, when faced with the power to exclude, choose to expand the circle, knowing that there is always room for more. Radical belonging. Some of the hardest work for those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus. Some of the most difficult work for those of us who long to be known as those who go and make disciples, because belonging is not without risk, but it is the place where the kingdom of God is made visible, where the way of Jesus moves from words and belief to embodied actions of welcome and invitation. You guys can come up. Radical belonging. Following Jesus' example of surprising grace and inclusion, we aspire for our building and our hearts and lives to be spaces where everyone can feel love and find belonging. We believe that this will lead to profound connections that enrich our lives, our faith, and our community. This is who we are, and this is who we long to be. A people who live, who know, and who announce that there is still room for more. Let's stand together.